All right. Looks like people are pouring in. That's a good thing. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is, wherever you are. That's great. I appreciate it, you being here. Yeah, we're on with Alex Russell. I'm really excited to chat with him. I've known Alex like several years actually, but we've never actually seen each other like live, like on a video or even in person. It's funny. I've done a little work with Alex too, on his writing, which is phenomenal. We're going to talk a lot about that. And gosh, I'm just really excited because this is going to be not just a fun conversation, but I think a master class when it comes to like performance and what it comes to when it comes to like platform strategy and just how we and just even like the last 10 years of front end web dev and what the implications have been for the future. So Alex, like just before we even start chatting much, can you walk us a little bit through the highlights of your career? Because you've touched upon some really fun or not fun, but like big key projects. And I think folks will want to know that context.
Well, let's just get this out of the way first. Highlights is extremely generous, and I appreciate your kindness, but it's not necessary.
I think it is, but
Okay,
okay.
let's agree to disagree. I am, hi, I'm Alex. Pronouns he, him. I am a dropout from a state school.
Yeah.
I'm not, the person that I think a lot of people assume that I am. I have for the last, I guess, 15 years or so worked on browsers, but before that, I made very large messes in JavaScript for people who were surprisingly willing to pay people to do that back in the early 2000s. And hey, Silver Star. So our, I think we all have different paths through how we get to technology, or specifically front end. And mine started as kind of a dirty JavaScript hacker back when DHTML was a 4-letter word. So, um, and then for my sins, initially I got invited on TC39, and that that room was in the ES4 era, and I don't know. I think that's probably passed into myth now. But we could spend the hour on it if you want.
That'd be
But
fun.
that project ES4, which was the JavaScript was ES3 at the time, and there were big designs that had kind of like spilled out from the end of the first browser wars, including things
Yes.
like an optional and gradual type system, which we still don't have in the language, um, classes, a whole passel of syntactic improvements. But the type system was kind of the big one.
That's huge.
And uh, Adobe, for their part, had implemented a bunch of that in ActionScript 3. And so the room had lots of people, and this was kind of after Microsoft had kind of disinvested from the browser in the early 2000s. Mozilla and Apple were investing heavily. Google hadn't yet made a browser. And let's just say it didn't go well. So I got an early ringside seat to some JavaScript drama in the Ajax era. And then I wanted, like my early experience in browsers was trying to use JavaScript to do things browsers shouldn't do, but which other application platforms did.
Yeah.
And there's this cohort of people, the HTML era folks, who push browsers extremely far. Most of them better than me at that, but we all learned a lot about the power that was sort of sitting latent there. Both in Netscape, surprisingly, actually, and more specifically in IE, which was much richer as an application platform, thanks to some steely-eyed missile men and women who put a ton of power into the platform rather intentionally, more than I think Microsoft knew at the time. So, um, uh, yeah, so we had lived in an era where browsers just added all kinds of extremely powerful new things every year, right? Like 1994 to like 2000, it was just
Yeah.
like the hits kept on coming every year. You got new stuff, and that new stuff was awesome. Some of it was regrettable
Yeah.
in retrospect,
Oh
but
yeah.
like it was extremely powerful. And then the taps closed, right?
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
okay, now what?
Yeah.
um, so a lot of us who had been doing little experiments on the side, we all kind of banded together and built a single kind of DHTML kind of meta toolkit we called it Dojo. which was kind of built out of the ashes of a bunch of other things. And we kept trying to solve those problems in userland to the extent that we could. So that was my start, and that's how we got here. And then browser teams were unwise enough to hire me, and we've been working on trying to make the platform a real boy ever since.
You are super busy. I know that, and I really appreciate you making the time for this. Now you talk a lot about JavaScript, but if lots of folks read your writing, they might get the sense that you're anti-JavaScript in a sense, but that's so untrue. Can you walk us through like why people might have that misconception?
Well, they might have that misconception because for roughly the last decade, I think I have been estranged from my familial home of the JavaScript community. That's not fun for me.
Yeah.
But for reasons we can get into, I believe it's necessary, because I want the web to win, right? Like foundationally, I work on a browser because I think the web is one of the only platforms that has delivered a whole kind of set of values that I think a lot of people in software want our software to embody, has done so consistently, and including in the sort of changing of hands about sort of who makes the browser and who's got the conch at any moment, right? Like how those things actually kind of play out. Is only facilitated by openness and standards, and that openness and standards and the extremely paranoid security model, which we brought on board largely as a part of mistakes made in the 90s. All of that has informed a platform which is now a generational platform, right? It sort of has entered the big leagues of sort of mainframes and the dominant client side operating systems like iOS and Android and Windows, to be a real application platform for a lot of the world's software. But it's unique in that it's open, it's interoperable, users get a say in what actually runs in their machine. Hopefully that they can change the user agent if that doesn't work out for them. And that disciplining feature of competition has helped to drive progress across the board for the last 30 plus years. And that has been extraordinarily powerful from my perspective. And I think all of that is at risk now. Not because of people wanting to do bad work, but because it's very cozy to imagine that because we're so successful on a desktop, that is success. And I don't think that's the game at all.
Well, and your latest series of a post, which is a 4-parter, and for folks who don't know, Alex blogs over at infrequently.org, and I love that name because it really is infrequently. So when you do speak, it has a nice like punctuation mark on it, which I really like. In this 4-part series, you really detail a trend toward, in the marketplace that really starts with mobile phones and the computing power that those have, and then the lack of computing power that floods the market in there. What exactly is that trend? Where like what? Oh, I'm sorry, we had an unmute there. But what? I mean, we think about today's devices as being super powerful, but what's up, with this idea that there's actually like a big dearth of like low powered devices?
Yeah. Okay. So stepping back a bit, the web didn't sort of succeed to the extent that it is now a success in a vacuum. A bunch of other things were happening at the same time that made the web a potential competitor to binary delivered per platform proprietary applications, which have much better properties in terms of nominal peak performance, and certainly peak performance for in a consistent way. You'll see this in like AAA games. Like consistency is the key. Waiting. There is a class of programmer who wants to tell you that the web doesn't work because of GC. And then I would refer them to 70+% of the jobs to be done on Windows happening in a browser, right? Like that's obviously nonsense, but it's nonsense in a very specifically true way, which is to say, for certain classes of applications, that can be true in the main, or at the limit, even if it's not true in the main. And so, stepping back, the Web 1 desktop, because in part because there was enough overhang. I think of it as overhang, right? Like just like an abundance of resources that were just sort of laying around for anyone to take.
Yes.
And that happened because of Moore's law and because of the deployment of broadband. And broadband and Moore's law, specifically in a situated environment where network latency was predictable. So that is to say, I send a packet to you over the link I'm currently wired into, and it's probably going to be the same for most of my TCP session, right? And the device's performance characteristics are pretty stable. I'm plugged into power, and so my CPU is going to dissipate as many watts as it was designed to dissipate under those relatively stable, power and thermal conditions. That is not computing in 2024, at least not on the client side. Client side computing in 2024, like this is a Samsung A23. It's got if it's got 3,000 milliamps hours of battery life, that'll be a small miracle. It's running chips. It's a device from a couple years ago. It's running CPU cores that were designed probably in 2015 or 14. It's got a lot of them, but that means that mostly it's dark silicon, which is to say, because of the power and thermal limits, right? It's encased in polycarbonate plastic. That is not a heat spreader. That's a heat trapper. And so, like, it can't go fast because it can't get rid of any heat. The only thing that's actually thermally conductive out of this thing is the screen, right?
Interesting. Oh, I didn't think about that in terms of the material and heat distribution and how that actually like fundamentally changes processing power.
So, and it's attached to a mobile network, right? And mobile networks have extremely variable latency properties. So all the protocols that we built, all the stuff that kind of like worked out in the web's favor in the late 90s and late 2000s stopped working when most computing went to mobile, right? And so like this new environmental reality puts absolutely fundamental constraints on us. And it is true that we all have supercomputers in our pockets. This thing has vector processing that would make a Cray weep, right? Like, it's awesome. It's terrible by modern standards, but it's awesome, right? Like, you can make really fast things on this device. I promise you can, and you can even do it in a browser, right? And the awesome thing is that browsers have been, hardcore tuning their systems, not just for security, which is kind of what facilitates the ability to tap on a link and have it feel safe, and you not feeling like, anything you do online is going to own you. But also for performance, right? Browsers are faster now than they've ever been. That's true in JavaScript. That's true in HTML. That's true for CSS. That's true for image formats. That's true for the wire protocols. Everything, top to bottom, they're better than they've ever been. It's a better platform. And so what I want is for people who make web pages to make competitive web pages, right? Like the browser is going to, the web is going to win mobile the way it won desktop if we can keep our awesome web pages within the limits of what's happening on mobile. Now, this is confounding because the big story is not, like the Pixel devices that I've got sitting around. That's not reality for the global market today. Because the big story of the last, call it 8 or 9 years, has been that everyone in the world who previously had a feature phone, which is billions of folks, all traded up, or to a first approximation, all traded up, right? Like, we're at the very tail of that process now. And they traded up to smartphones. And those folks who had feature phones, billions of them, aren't wealthy. So the rate at which they acquired smartphones was the rate at which the price of smartphones fell. And that means that you have an incrementally larger market every year. But the incrementally larger market is facilitated by the bill of materials, like the literal cost to produce, going down, right? And so what that means is that for the last decade, we have been producing ever larger volumes of the same phone.
Yes.
Let that sink in. We have been producing an explosion of the same phone from 2015 or 2016 and handing it to billions of people.
And that's all because of the rules of economics, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And this is a revolution. It absolutely is. what we experienced in kind of, I'm just going to say wealthy Western markets is that we would spend constant dollar or euro and get a faster phone every year. That
Yes.
has not been the experience of most folks. And in fact, in many wealthy Western markets, the utility of phones became so high that people's willingness to pay went up. And so we actually started spending more as an average selling price in many wealthy geographies for the same cohort of people who previously had devices. And so, I think when the iPhone came out, it was like a $300 or $400 device in constant dollar terms. You can buy a $1,500 iPhone today, right? Like, what is that? That is an exquisitely engineered device. You can buy $1,000 Android device. It is an exquisitely engineered device, and your willingness to pay is based on a long experience of having the next increment of that thing being awesome, be better for you experientially.
Yes.
Folks who are just new to the market, they don't have that experience, right? Like it's literally not in their hands yet. So,
Yeah.
But to keep the average selling price of phones, which has been relatively stable over the last decade, hovering, in inflation adjusted dollars between $300 and $350. It's just in the last year or two just peaked up, and we can talk about that. But
Sure.
Supply chain stuff, there was a pandemic, blah blah blah.
Yes.
But it was extraordinarily stable. And most of the devices in market are from that earlier period. And to get a stability in the average selling price to be constant as the price of the high-end phone keeps going up, you got to sell a lot more of the low-end phones as their price falls, right? So the denominator has of cheap phones, as their price falls, you have to have an explosion of them. You have to go from 2 to 1 to go to 10 to 1 to support.
Well, you have to sell 3 of them just to support one of the feature phones, right? Or I mean,
to get to $350 ish, you got to sell between $800 and $1,000 phones to offset every $1,000 iPhone, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what we did.
Why
that's what we did.
Now,
so that's now the ground truth. That's the reality.
Now, what you're describing is clearly a great divide in consumerism and in the representation of users and how they're distributed across technology. At the same time, I mean, you're well familiar when Chris Coyier described a great divide in the front end community too, between the whole joke was, 2 front end web developers walk into a bar, they have nothing to talk about, right? And that's because we had this JavaScript done got big, right? And now we're dealing with this client side divide versus the server side divide, and we're starting to talk about things like CSS and JS, and we're talking about React and all kinds of other types of frameworks. Was this also exacerbating the situation at the same time? Did this have to happen at the same time as this device explosion?
I appreciate your dedication to the leading question. Did it have to happen? No. Did it happen? Absolutely. I don't want to spend too much time on how what happened.
Sure.
I will, except to highlight a couple of things. The first is that there are at least two kinds of ways to mislead people. One is to tell them something that's not true, and that can have both the version of it in which you intend for the other person to hear something that you knew to be false. The other is that you didn't know. And the other way is just not tell people things that would recontextualize the information that they have in a way that causes them to think differently about it in the way that maybe you do. That's an error of a sin of omission, right? It's a materially false misstatement, but by omission. I will say that most of the things that happened over the last decade were omissions. Many of them willful, especially after it was pointed out that these omissions were material. And I don't think that we have a healthy front end discourse as a result. We're not talking about I do this post every year about this time. I started the research for the next one. It's not out yet. I apologize. Sorry, Jeff.
I'll read it.
It'll be out at some point. But the TLDR here is that I keep studying the device and network landscape because I desperately want that overhang of resources to show up again. Because that, growth in resources absolves a lot of sins, right? You can make huge messes with JavaScript or anything else, badly load your fonts, whatever. And if the networks are fast enough and the CPUs are fast enough, yeah, doesn't matter, right? Like we have to get into the same interaction class. We have to get in the same ballpark of speed as native apps. And once we're there, the web's got these incredible properties, right? Like anyone can deploy, you can iterate at the speed of pushing something to your own web server. It's safe by default. It's interoperable. You can invest in it once. You don't have to build 5 versions of it, and which slowly destroys your product team velocity as you both, fight over like what the right rounding for a corner on a button is across different operating systems, but then also have to like wait on app store delays. Like all that stuff is nonsense. You don't have to have it, and we have an existence proof in desktop, right? Like that's just kind of how it is. So given that that's a future that we could have, that we could all go and collectively purchase, why hasn't it arrived? And my hope is that that CPUs and networks get fast enough that we don't have to talk about any of this stuff anymore. But we do have to like get back to a place where our conversation around what the limits are is healthier, and like which technologies are actually working for folks. I'm both upset on behalf of the people who I've been working with, to like the teams and the nonprofits and all the rest of the governments I've been working with to try to like help make their web apps better over the last decade. That they were led down the primrose path, and that the front end discourse isn't kind of leveling with them about what actually works under these constraints. But I'm optimistic that if we get either better behavior out of our thought leaders and better constraints in our environment, that the web's inherent advantages can take over again, and that we can kind of have a late 90s moment again for the web. So that's my hope. That's what I spend a lot of my time working on.
Sure. I find that there are a lot of front end devs in having hallway conversations who feel who really do embody the standards that you talked about, or the ideals that you talk about with the web and its openness and its transparency and its ability to win in the mobile web, but feel like they're in between a rock and a hard place when it comes to actually working that way, because of course, the need to be employed and to earn a paycheck and everything else. Like at what point can there be a pivot, or what sort of discourse has to happen if the players themselves feel hamstrung?
Yeah, I should say that I have a lot of empathy for this. I've worked with hundreds of teams at this point since we launched PWAs in 2015, and many of them both exhibit the same pathologies and express the same both implicit and explicit constraints that are ecosystem level constraints, right? Like a meme has taken hold that you're not doing something modern if you're not starting down your next project with a toolkit that was based on the constraints of IE 6, 7, and 8, right? Like it's bewildering to me. Like just for context, Microsoft doesn't support any version of IE in its primary web apps. Like you can't buy IE 11 from us. We won't sell it to you. And we don't support it, right? So like the idea that any front-end developer, like, by the way, mobile has just like whizzed past desktop on like the kind of the interoperability, like the legacy browser thing. Like there to a first approximation, there aren't any legacy browsers on mobile devices. They just don't exist. So the only place that you would have a legacy browser is in the kind of like half of the web market, or like fifth to quarter of the computing market, client-side computing market, where desktops show up, and legacy browsers aren't really there either anymore. The auto updater revolution that Chrome ushered in really did its job.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
So from that perspective, it's a mystery that like the spell has not already been broken. On one level, and on the other hand, I think it's entirely predictable, right? Like we have had 20 years now in which front-end frameworks are totalizing questions, right? Like which framework do you use defines all of the choice architecture past that that
Oh,
threshold question, right? Like that
yes.
waterfall, that watershed really is a steep waterfall, and
It's
once
a
you're on the other
line in
side
the
of it, it's
sand.
expensive to climb back out. Um, but that's not how like teams who are like I sort of think of this as like, people call it like modern art versus contemporary art. Contemporary
Interesting.
stuff is like built in like the last 30 or 40 years, and modern art is from a century ago.
Yeah,
um,
interesting.
we have modern front end in the same
Mm.
sense as we have modern art, right? Like
My gosh.
modern front end is uh potentially beautiful design for an earlier era. It may not
Yeah.
be the right thing in your apartment. um
Yeah.
it now might, but it is also fantastically expensive, right? Like pieces that represent that heritage, sell for a premium, and I guess that's good for front enders trying to make a buck. But it's really bad when the results are terrible. Like if the furniture is also super uncomfortable. Like I had this I was living in London for a while, and we had this example of this like one, I guess it was one of Charles Eames designed sort of like breakfast chair in this sort of apartment that we were renting, which just became furnished. And I would never pick this chair because every time you sat down and like moved your sort of your foot like back just a smidge, the back of your heel, like the tendon, would
Yeah.
immediately hit this little wire, and it was just painful as all
Oh,
get out. And it was just above where your shoe was. So even if you wore shoes inside, it was just like always gonna like get you.
interesting.
And like
Yeah.
this classic design flaw, like I guess it's a an iconic kind of a looking thing.
Looks
But it's also
pretty.
just bad, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the same
So,
bad, right?
yeah, it's just bad. It's just bad design, right? So we can call bad design, and we can certainly call it outdated, and we can say that it's maybe a museum piece, right? It doesn't necessarily have to sit in our house. So what is contemporary front end? Contemporary front end is like browsers from the last 8, 6, 5 years, because that's really what the entire market is slinging today. Like
Yeah.
no one, I promise you, if you're starting a new project, even updating an old project, there is no IE11 in your life. Like not
Yeah.
really. Anyone who tells you
No.
that you have to support it, I mean, you're either inside of a facility in which you're building customized situated software for a user
Yes.
base that can't move, and you're definitely in legacy land. But we can call that legacy land. We don't have to pull any of that stuff with us into other kinds of projects. Like
No.
that's an evolutionary vestigial branch, right? It's gone, right? Okay, so we can reset our expectations about like what the market actually has in its pockets and in its bags, and say modern browsers don't have any of that nonsense. And that means that everybody has web components, everybody has a modern DOM, everybody has modern JavaScript. You don't need to transpile as though you're going to be like, I mean,
Yeah.
browsers are C++ land. So like my mental language here was like, compiling down to run on a 386, right? Like compilers still support that. It's just why, right? Like you would want to take advantage of the modern hardware, and browsers are now the modern hardware equivalent. So let's take advantage of the modern hardware, and that liberates us to do a bunch of things. And the most important of them is that it makes frameworks less totalizing. Like it
Yeah.
stops being a watershed choice, and it just becomes another step down the path that you can easily reverse past, right?
Yeah.
If your CSS isn't trapped in a framework specific CSS and JS thing, and it's just sitting in a file, like then it's just
Yeah.
CSS, right? If your HTML is just like standards based HTML, then it's just standards based HTML, right?
Yeah.
Um,
That separation
and
of concerns is still desirable.
yeah, and you can add things and you can take them away, but like the core of your system doesn't have to be wrapped around the assumption that you're going to be pulling in this extremely expensive totalizing stack for the benefit of being able to stub the back of your heel every morning as you sit down to eat some eggs, right? Like that's not like
Yeah.
we don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah. There's been many posts written over many years about or lauding the idea of like boring is good, actually, especially when it comes to web design or even architectures. But we don't celebrate them enough. Is
Hmm.
it like is that something that like maybe we don't do as well in a community, is like celebrate something that performs extremely well? May not be the sexiest looking thing in the whole world or the most modern stack of things, but it performs extremely well. And I think about like specifically going back to the reckoning, I believe like part 3 in there, part 2, you go into these public sector comparisons of sites. Specifically you have I mean, the brilliant one is San Francisco, or is California's SNAP program in there that takes a whopping 30 seconds to load versus yes, this one here, where it can load up in 6 seconds, and it looks better, it looks great, and yet why do we not err on that side of things, that towards like progressive enhancement and like core principles like that, and we just like go straight to shipping expensive modules instead?
Yeah, we have a series of problems, right? And they are layered and interlocking. The first, and I think the foundational one is kind of defining what are we doing here, right? Like
Yeah.
if I sit down and I take a contract to make a website, the most important question you can ask and maybe try to answer about that website is, who is it for, right? Like,
Yeah.
is it
Yeah, of course.
is it for people who
It's
look
for us as developers.
well, this is where I call bullshit.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a a
Oh.
family show. This is where I call bullshit on the developer experience
Yes.
meme. I don't know what else to call it, right? Like in the
Yeah.
memetics sense of the idea, implicit and sometimes explicit, that if we make things better for developers, that we will then be liberated to make things better for end users.
Yeah.
And I have seen the very marginal truth in that play out in my own life, right? Like I have this like
Yeah.
formative experience working on the Chrome team. This would have been like 2008 or 9. And I was using this old machine as a build box, and they offered the new machines, and I was suffering with the old one because I felt very greedy for like opting. Like they just given me the old one like 6 months ago, and it was like super beefy machine. And at some point, my boss says, we're talking about build times. He's like, well, don't you have one of the new
No.
don't you have one of the new machines? And I said, no, that seems excessive. And he's like, well, what do we pay you? Right. I'm like, okay, in comparison to your salary, the new machine is not very expensive. So get the new machine. You can build that much faster. It really changes my life. Like things that make things better for developers actually do allow us to reduce our cycle times, and reducing cycle times is extremely important to making better software, right? Like, let's just stipulate that as true. Let's also stipulate it as like the weak force, right? It's not the strong force, right? It's not the strong electromagnetic force. It's gravity, relatively speaking. Like you can make some things, change using that mechanism, but its impact on your day-to-day is pervasive, but it's also extremely diffuse. And if you're sitting there trying to like, manipulate an object, it's not the primary thing going on, right? Like the thing going on is all the stuff that binds the materials together that you want to arrange into some assortment. That's the strong force stuff. And to get good at that, you can't just go like manipulate gravity to like make you a better table. You actually have to get good at the woodworking. So we have to like look at the constraints of what we're building and for who in that situated sense. We can assume gravity, right? And we can maybe build a rocket ship, like change the rate of acceleration, something. But those are like special case events that you're going to engineer separately for. The primary job is to care about who's going to use the machine, and then to engineer the machine to the constraints of those users, right? Both our own constraints as developers, which we can loosen somewhat. But the most impactful thing is not our developer experience. It is the experience of the user. And the only way you make a good website is giving a shit about the user. That is the only way you make a good website. That's it, right? And it doesn't matter what tool you use, right? Like I've seen people utterly fail with very simple tools, and I have seen people succeed wildly with incredible monstrosities based on legacy technology, right? We can lighten our load. We can start with like less overhead and overhang. That generally improves our potential for success. So it's not dispositive either way. But we can classify these forces by strength, right? And we can say that developer experience has almost no explanatory power for whether or not the table that you designed comes up good. Right? Yes. The only thing that matters to a first approximation in the sort of same order of magnitude as your decisions about your work is whether or not you gave a shit about the user, which puts the user at the center, and then asks the question, which user? Okay, now we have a data question, and data questions are the better kinds of questions, because when we can answer the data questions, we can start to actually make real progress against like, what are our constraints and who are we designing for and all that kind of stuff. So that's how I think our our industry has led itself astray to a large degree by sort of taking these, I think of like developer experience. Are you familiar with the Laffer curve?
No, no, what's that?
Okay, so if you hear kind of modern economists kind of laugh, I guess ironically, at Art Laffer. He was this guy who did this big back of the napkin kind of drawing for Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and as a way to explain, again, a kind of weak force of supply side economics. Now, there is some truth. Again, there is some truth at the margin in these theories, right? Both in developer experience and in supply side constraints on prosperity.
Yeah.
But that's not the main thing. Right? And if you get people to fixate on the marginal thing and not the main thing, you've taken your eye off the ball. And so, like once we can put the developer experience kind of back in context, we can see that it has power for us at the margin and not in the main. And our systems and processes for listening to users and understanding, their environment and their constraints are much more powerful. You can succeed with a text editor. You don't need a huge tool chain. You can succeed with PHP. You don't need Haskell. You can pick any of these things, right? These are choices you can make about your implementation. It is true that the good craftsman doesn't blame their tools, but also good craftsmen don't bring bad tools to the job. So the covariateness of people like picking good, high quality developer experience tools because they experience that they can do a better job with those tools, and they care about users, we should reattribute to them primarily caring about users rather than their ability to sort of manipulate magnetic fields and gravity.
Well, I like this comment that Attila puts in the chat here, saying, so developer experience that makes it easy to empathize with our users is the sweet spot.
No,
exactly. So
nonsense. Go look.
Yeah.
The thing that matters is going and looking. I'm sorry for being quite so emphatic about this, but we have to kill this idea dead. It's a zombie. It's a zombie. The developer experience does not make you empathize with your users. The thing that makes you empathize with your users is going and fucking looking. Care enough about your product and your users to go look at their environment. Look. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's the ball game. Go look.
I really appreciate you jumped on that because where I was leading that, obviously it was like, well, who's the honest then or who has the honest to develop that empathy? You can't really, codify that sort of thing in a developer experience sort of guide. In that same breath, you compared gov.uk's experience, to California's as well, showing like, hey, 4-second, jump on this in a like kind sort of public sector industry, but they also do a good job of like setting expectations for what it is they're working with and what their goals are with that. Does the U.S. not do that, to the same extent? Like what the heck is going on here?
Yeah. Sorry for swearing at you, Till. I wasn't swearing at you. I was.
Oh, I know you were.
Well, not you, Jeff. Attila in the comments. I just wanted to clarify, Attila. I think you're probably a lovely person who wants to do good work, and I hope we can see eye to eye on this at some point. I will say, again, developer experience does matter at the margins, but I would just want to like tease this apart and say the thing you bring to your work that is much more important is not the tool, it's the caring. And Attila, I see you in this comment saying that you care. That's what matters. You're gonna do a good job because you care, and that's what the GovUK has brought to this. And if I look at some of the public sector benefit sites that I traced in that post, by the way, I should give some credit to the California department that is responsible for this. After that post, they did flip the flag at on AWS in CloudFront that does compress resources now. So
awesome.
it is somewhat faster. But it is now the hardest kind of problem to solve because they bought and brought along with them this very tall pile of what are now old wives' tales about what kind of technology is modern. Like they thought they were getting contemporary technology and they bought modern art. Right.
And on top of that, they're locked into a vendor now that's supporting them in this, right?
Yeah. And so now they have the kinds of problems that, we see everywhere in our kind of
Yeah.
consulting work. So
Oh,
I should
absolutely.
say a little bit about like what I do for a living. Um, I work in a browser, and I see Andy is in the comments here as well. Andy is one of the co-leads with me, and a guy named Zohir. And we yeah. um, Andy's right. We kind of go around the company and we sort of hung a shingle and said, hey, we want to hear about your problems. Because if you're making a platform, the people who can tell you most about why your platform isn't great are the people who are using it all day, which is your developers. And so we want to learn intentionally because the size of the browser team versus the platform teams compared to the size of the ecosystem people who are using the APIs and tools that we produce is like thousands to one, right? So the time that you spend as an engineer or a product manager or someone's working in standards on a browser team is extremely valuable from the opportunity cost perspective. And so the way that you make fewer mistakes that are extremely expensive to pay down are by going and listening intently and then trying to triangulate from that. So we set up a project, we call it Project Sidecar, and we go around the company and we kind of have rebuilt this sort of, we call it a listening system, the kind of listening system that the Chrome team had built sort of intentionally over years with external partners, and we built that as part of not just developer relations, but also the launch PWAs from the engineering and product management side. But that's a long way around to say, if you sit with your customers, you'll learn a lot, things you didn't expect to hear. And so we go and we sit with teams at Microsoft, and they have the exact same problems that the California government does, but they have much more money and much more expertise with which to attack them. And so it is terrifying to me to see someone like, public sector service that is trying to deliver for folks who are literally on the margins of society, buying into choices which stop being easily reversible mistakes, right? Like Control Z takes a long time. You got to press it really hard if you buy into these very expensive JavaScript first stacks. Whereas if you start with a simpler stack, Control Z is much cheaper. And so there's a lot going on here, but I will say the deep wisdom in what the UK's government digital service put together as their thou shalt use progressive enhancement edict is basically saying for most of the websites that they build, which is, I would say pretty much most websites, like you're going to know if it's not your website. I think a lot of folks are a little bit confused about this point. If you've got very long sessions where people are spending a lot of time, like an editing user interface, think Figma or Google Docs or Word or Excel or PowerPoint, those kinds of things, you're going to know it. Right? You have this problem, and this problem presents itself primarily as a data synchronization problem because you worry a lot about losing user data in a way that's not like intrinsic to the platform, right? Like browsers are pretty good about restoring form state, that kind of thing. If that's not your problem, if you're not thinking about a synchronization problem, you very likely, given modern web technology, don't have any of the adjacent problems that would require a front-end framework like the ones that people are primarily picking off today.
Thanks for saying that. Yes.
So you can kind of contextualize this by like, how long are my sessions and where does my data live? If my data has to be stored locally, otherwise I'm going to lose it, or I have to operate on it many times over the course of a session, then you probably need a lot more JavaScript, right? You probably need more than the platform can intrinsically do today because you have a synchronization problem. On the other hand, if you don't have that problem, which is, again, most websites, then from just the perspective of choosing cheaper mistakes to remediate, you should pick the simpler stack. And the simpler stack does not involve a bundler. Like you should probably see how far you can get without one, and then add it incrementally. And folks will have lots of stories about how they needed to like add all this technology incrementally over time and how that turned into a real problem for them. But I would submit that is a cheaper class of problem to try to solve. It certainly has been the experience of the teams that I've worked with that the assumption of these tall stacks is hurting them in ways that they do pay for. Like you cannot push it off forever. And if your thing is even moderately successful, you're going to end up in that spot.
What I also really appreciate in the way that you contextualize these, your thoughts and your arguments is that there's a real human edge to this. It's not just all about economics and performance and bytes and transferring and syncing up things, but there's a real human inequality issue happening, that's pervasive, throughout this. And that's because we have this huge sector of people that just don't have the power to run these stacks that we're shipping. And because of that, we're running into issues where, especially in the public sector, which you care a lot about, they're not able to get the simple basic services that they need.
I want to be a little bit. I try to always be data driven about these questions, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's better that there be public services online than not, right? Like the
Yes. Oh,
counterfactual is this
absolutely.
service wasn't going to be there online. It's better to have it online. So let's like, you know, we don't have to exactly stop and slow clap for folks to do a bad job and bring anything online, but we can, laud the effort and say, thank you for bringing it online. This is good. Thank you for not making a native app, right? Like that would be a further exclusionary step, right? Like there's a bunch of things that you can say about this that are like, good first steps. It can also be the case that, you can self-defeat. And so I don't blame, for instance, the state of California or the state of, I think, New Jersey or Indiana, or any of the sort of the civil servants who, civil servants should know their customers, right? And they should be testing as their customers. So let's stipulate that. But beyond that, I have seen so many times folks who confidently walk into a team and say, well, we got to rewrite this in Angular. We got to rewrite this in React because your stack is not modern. And from an engineering leadership perspective, I want to push back on that and say, so you're telling me that you don't want to understand your application? Why do you think you're going to make a good one? Right? Like, why do you think you're going to do a good version of the next iteration of this if you are not willing to sit, deeply with this and start to try to like modify it in place, right? If you're just going to say, well, this is not modern, we have to throw it out. I actually just sort of flip the bit and say, that's not good engineering. Because what you haven't done is say, what are the constraints that we have to engineer under? Because engineering is doing design under constraint for the benefit of society and end users. And the opposite of engineering is bullshitting. And that's bullshitting, right? So if you're not going to do engineering, you probably shouldn't get paid an engineering salary. Is kind of where I end up on that question. And I've seen this happen over and over and over and over again. It gets dressed up in lots and lots of ways, but like the enthusiasms of engineers, because we've been telling ourselves and everyone else for several decades now that engineers are golden children, have ended up leading a lot of folks astray. And we have to reground ourselves and say, okay, it's clearly the case that folks who are making technology recommendations have a lot of influence. We wouldn't be in the situation if the folks who made technology recommendations did not have a lot of influence, right? So you're not going to win every fight. There's going to be a bunch of people around you who want to do something else and maybe some resume-oriented development. But that doesn't mean that you have to like preemptively give in, right? You can take the user side, and even if you end up in a very expensive stack that is very slow to start with, you can still advocate for the user. So our way out is not to say, oh, I guess we adopted React, we can't do anything. It's to say, well, okay, maybe we adopted React. Who's the user, right? Just put the user back in the center of the conversation at every opportunity, and then you can start to reframe choices. Now, it's going to be much more expensive when you've gone down that road and you're in that cul-de-sac. God knows, I've seen every version of that cost, but it's still possible to dig yourself out of that ditch, right? Like Andy and I and Zohar and a lot of other folks on the Edge team, we spend a lot of our days doing it, and we can do it pretty successfully now, right? The tools are getting better.
Yeah.
And the great news is that Google's Core Web Vitals is starting to really put pressure on the ecosystem. When I said earlier that people are kind of like maybe a little bit convinced without evidence that their thing definitely needs to be an SPA. The good news is that the interaction next paint metric that Annie and her team put together, Annie Sullivan and her team at Google put together, really is sort of showing that, the premise of all of this technology was that we're going to deliver better user experiences. Oh no, we're not delivering better user experiences. customers are going to notice, right? Like customers are going to notice because it's going to affect their SEO. And so the loop has been closed, even in a very weak way, which I think INP and Core Vitals represent. But even that very weak way is starting to like chip away at the nonsense. And so you can use that kind of evidence in this attempt to kind of recenter the user in the conversation and push back on ungrounded enthusiasms.
Now, JavaScript frameworks aren't the only thing that we have to reckon with. In this landscape, you've written extensively about gatekeeping well when it comes to browser vendors, in particular when it comes to mobile web browsers and in the lack of browser choice in there.
Yeah.
Could you just like succinctly articulate the problems that people might not understand?
Okay, so stepping back, I want the web to win.
Yeah.
And because 4 out of every 5 devices, three or 4 out of every 4 or 5 devices that get sold, depends on the year, depends on the market, right? That can run a browser is a phone. That means that for us to have jobs on the web in another 5 or 10 years, the web needs to be relevant on mobile. Otherwise, we're just going to be COBOL programmers tinkering away at our mainframes, right? Like generational software platforms never die, but they do fade away. And the difference between those two is relevance. So to keep the web relevant, the web needs to compete. And to compete, the web needs both to feel good, right? It needs, moderately decent performance, in the main. And we'll get there different ways. We could cap our JavaScript emissions and wait for faster CPUs, which are going to come at some point. They're not there yet. We've got a lot of overhang to get rid of from the JavaScript side before the CPUs and networks will catch us up. But there is some progress there. But if we get there, that's necessary but not sufficient, right? Because the web started to attack adjacent use cases to just like showing the news online because it added these other APIs, right? Like the AJAX revolution happened not because the web had HTTP and forums, because it was possible to use those things in ways that didn't, maybe disturb the user interface quite so much. And then there's a bunch of application classes that require adjacent capabilities. So I've spent a bunch of my careers, maybe a strong way to put it, but like a bunch of my time working on projects like Project Fugu and the thing before it, Project Fizz, that added PWAs and push notifications, and then Bluetooth, and now USB and hidden serial and file system access, and a bunch of other like web transport and a bunch of other like low-level things that make it possible to add the things that unlock other classes of applications, and that's going great on desktop. The place where we have a problem is that on mobile, all of those capabilities more or less exist in a pretty good way on Android, which is, at least on device sales, between 75 and 80% of the market every year, even still. And, all rich people carry iPhones. And those capabilities aren't there. Apple has both suppressed browser engine choice very effectively, which wouldn't be a problem if WebKit was good, but it is not. And I don't mean that as like a way to denigrate the good people working on WebKit. I mean that as like an objective sense of like, is it moderately capable? And the answer has been no for a long time. But not only that, it is frequently broken. So the lack of capability coupled with frequent breakage for core features, and I mean things like storing data and scrolling, right? Like, I'm not talking about push notifications, which were delayed by like 8 years, but like, the basics.
Interaction,
tapping, swiping, scrolling, those things. The fact that those are so frequently, the fact that those are so, Roderick Ellis did a masterful sort of recitation of those bugs here. The fact that iOS, which is what every company boss, every director, every wealthy user who has a say in the sort of production and purchasing pipeline of web properties, because the web sucks for them, effectively that's a cap on our ability to compete.
We're
so
always good
it would be
the lowest, right?
Yeah. And that lowest common denominator effect is amplified by wealth inequality, right?
Yes.
Like rich people in our societies have a lot more influence.
Yeah, just is.
And so when the web sucks for them, it basically sucks for everyone.
Yeah.
Now, the good news is that those folks aren't going to feel the effects of bad CPUs or bad networks, right? They're enfranchised at that level. But Apple has managed to effectively cap the web's potential. Google and Facebook aren't helping. I mean, I've got a whole series of posts on that.
Yes.
We can put a pin in that for the second. Let's just say between Apple, Google, and Facebook, big tech has managed to do to the web what Microsoft from the late 90s couldn't, which was to prevent it from emerging as a true threat to proprietary platforms.
I didn't think about it in that context, but that's absolutely true.
Yeah. That's bad, I think. I want the web to win. So what do we do about it? So this chap, Roderick, I mentioned, is part of this this group called Open Web Advocacy. You can go join them. They've got a Discord. They've got a mailing list, I think, maybe. They write these long documents. I have been a technical advisor to them in the past, but they and sometimes if they ping, I will continue to advise. But they are providing detailed technical information about the problems that developers are facing to regulators, and that has generated, probably from my perspective as a platform strategist, it's generated a huge fraction of the progress in Safari that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years. So if you want to continue to be a working web developer into the future, I would say go support them. It's urgent. There's an opportunity there to kind of like have the web win on mobile. And if we add the benefits of browser engine competition and choice to the benefits of hopefully capped JavaScript emissions and improving resource availability, I think all the necessary conditions for the web to win will once again emerge. We're not there yet. There's more to do, but like the work is just work. We can do it. I think it's in front of us.
Well, just because we're coming up at the hour, I just want to say, wholesale here, like I hope everyone's seeing what the what this large landscape is, and that there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of like major trends happening that are coalescing right before our very eyes. And sometimes when you're this close to something, it's hard to notice things that move at a glacial pace. But when we zoom way out on this, in the context of history, we'll see this a lot more clearly. But thank you, Alex, for taking the time not only to just talk about this stuff, but to actually like map this stuff out for us to help see what the chain of events is, but also to understand what the way out of it is and what the right course of history is for the web winning, whether it's desktop or mobile or anywhere else. Right before we say bye, can I ask you just a few rapid fire questions?
Yeah, go for it.
Just like what? Yeah. What is your favorite website of all time?
My favorite website of all time?
Yeah.
I don't even know if it's still online.
Yeah, that's the best part.
There was a website from the late 90s called suck.com. I think it's probably an archive you can find someplace. It was very funny, had brilliant writers. That was very formative for me and as a pimply faced programmer in the late 90s. Yeah.
If you could subscribe to only one newsletter, which is it?
It would not surprise you that it's probably not. It's only more tangentially tech related.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find the URL. Trying to remember. There's a friend from the old Chrome team called who made a thing called Subconscious.
Yeah. Oh, neat. Heard of that one.
And he continues to write in a truly. I'll find the link and drop it in the chat.
Thank you.
In a truly thoughtful way. Gordon Brander.
Yeah, just last one. Space Jam 1996 or 2001?
Neither. They're bad movies.
Thank you very much. That was perfect. And thank you for hanging out with us, Alex. I just on a personal note, it's really fun to for me to finally get to chat with you like in real time and not just over
That's extremely kind.
emails
You
or
too.
whatever else.
Yeah.
So thank you. And thank you everyone for hanging out. Like what a fun time. It's always fun to take a break and just chat for an hour about the things in our industry. So thanks a lot.